Magnate gives an unlimited credit card to a homeless man. The homeless man uses the card to make surprising purchases. The purchase notifications reveal something the millionaire did not expect. Old secrets resurface, threatening newly discovered family ties. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Michael Thompson gazed out at the colonial town of New Haven through the French windows of his hilltop mansion. The afternoon sun tinged the centuries-old walls and colonial rooftops with golden hues, creating a spectacle that used to enchant him, but now seemed devoid of meaning. At 45, owner of one of the largest hotel chains in America, he had everything money could buy, except what he needed most: a purpose. The three-story mansion, with its contemporary architecture contrasting with the town's historic setting, was too quiet since the departure of his father, Arthur Thompson, 3 months ago. The white walls adorned with expensive artwork seemed colder, and the endless corridors echoed only his own lonely footsteps. "You're making progress, Michael," said Dr. Helen, his therapist, adjusting her gold-rimmed glasses while consulting her notes. "But I still sense a resistance to accepting your own emotions." Michael shifted uncomfortably in the leather armchair of the office. The weekly sessions had become his only truly personal commitment in a schedule packed with corporate meetings. "Progress?" he questioned, running a hand through the grey hair at his temples. "Doctor, I manage over 50 hotels. I have a growing fortune, and yet I feel completely lost. My father built this empire from scratch, and now that he's gone, I realize I don't know what my true role is in all of this." The psychologist observed him carefully before responding. "Maybe it's time to look for meaning beyond business, Michael. Your father left an impressive business legacy, but what will your legacy be as a human being?" That question haunted him all the way back home. Driving his Porsche through the steep streets of New Haven, Michael observed life happening around him. Tourists photographing the historic churches, shopkeepers organizing their stores, college students chatting animatedly on the historic steps. At home, he dismissed the staff early, something unusual in his routine. He needed the silence, the solitude, to process his thoughts. He went up to the main balcony, his private refuge with a panoramic view of the town. The sun was beginning to set, and the lights of houses and establishments were starting to dot the landscape like small, earthly stars. That's when his gaze caught an unusual scene in the central square. A man, apparently homeless, was sharing a piece of bread with a dog. There was something about the scene that intrigued him deeply. The man, even in his evident simplicity, showed a serenity that Michael instantly envied. He grabbed his bird-watching binoculars, a hobby abandoned years ago, and focused on the figure. The man appeared to be about 50 years old, with graying hair and stubble, but maintained a dignity in his gestures that didn't match his worn clothes. His eyes, even from a distance, seemed to carry stories that Michael suddenly wanted to know. An idea began to form in his mind, first as a distant spark, then as a flash of inspiration. His father always said that the greatest opportunities arise from the most unlikely encounters. Maybe it was time to create such an encounter. Michael grabbed his coat and wallet, ignoring the messages blinking on his cell phone. For the first time in a long time, he felt something different from the usual emptiness: curiosity. A genuine curiosity that compelled him to go down to the town center, approach that stranger, and maybe discover something about himself in the process. As he descended the stairs of his mansion, he remembered his father's words on his last day of lucidity. "Son, true wealth isn't in the hotels I built, but in the moments when I had the courage to follow my intuition, even when everyone said it was crazy." The panoramic elevator smoothly descended the 3 floors of the mansion, and Michael watched the town approaching through the glass. His mother, Barbara, would certainly disapprove of what he was about to do. The matriarch of the Thompson family always valued appropriate distance from common people, as she used to say. But something stronger propelled him, a force he hadn't felt since adolescence, when he still dreamed of being a photographer before taking over the family business. As he left through the main gates, he waved to the night security guard, who observed him with puzzlement. It wasn't common to see the boss leaving on foot at that hour. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the fresh night air of New England fill his lungs. Each step towards the historic center seemed to take him not only closer to that stranger, but also closer to a version of himself he had forgotten existed. The cobblestone streets echoed under Michael's Italian shoes as he descended towards the central square. The night air carried New Haven's characteristic aroma, a mixture of roasted coffee from century-old bakeries, jasmine from colonial gardens, and history impregnated in the old walls. The man was still there, now sitting on one of the square's benches, observing the movement of the last tourists returning to their hotels. The dog remained by his side, like a faithful guardian. As Michael approached, he could better distinguish the details. The man wore a faded but clean plaid shirt, and his calloused hands indicated a life of work. "Good evening," Michael said, his voice sounding more hesitant than he would have liked. The man looked up, revealing eyes of a deep blue that contrasted with his sun-marked skin. "Good evening, sir," he replied with a deep and polite voice which surprised Michael. There was something familiar about that timbre, something he couldn't identify. "May I sit down?" The man made an affirmative gesture, sliding to the side of the bench. "The square is public," he responded with a slight smile at the corners of his mouth. Michael settled in, feeling the rough texture of the old wooden bench, a sensation so different from the soft leather of his armchairs. For a few moments they sat in silence, observing the lights of the old town that were turning on one by one. "My name is John," the man introduced himself spontaneously. "And this here is Poet," he pointed to the mutt dog that was wagging its tail lazily. "Poet? Yes, because he always seems to be contemplating something that no one else sees," John explained, with a glimmer of affection in his eyes. "And you, sir? What's your name?" "Michael," he replied, deliberately omitting his surname. "Why are you here, John?" The question came out more direct than he intended, but John didn't seem to take offense. On the contrary, his eyes gained a nostalgic gleam. "Life has its paths, Michael. Sometimes we choose some, other times we are chosen by them. I've been many things: a literature teacher in a rural school, a bookseller, even a writer of stories that no one read. Now I'm just an observer of other people's stories." Michael felt his curiosity increase. The way John expressed himself didn't match his current appearance. "And what stories have you been observing?" John gestured towards the square. "See that lady at the flower shop? Every day she keeps a white rose under the counter. It's for an old love that never materialized, but who still passes by here every Thursday to buy flowers for his wife? Or that waiter at the cafe? He works 2 shifts to pay for his daughter's medical school." Michael watched fascinated as John narrated these stories with a mixture of respect and affection. It was as if he kept the town's secrets in his heart. "And you, Michael? What's your story?" The question caught him off guard. I have everything anyone could want, but I feel empty." John nodded, as if that confession didn't surprise him. "You know, Michael, true wealth isn't always where we think we'll find it." At that moment, an idea began to form in Michael's mind. It was absurd, impulsive, and potentially dangerous, exactly the kind of thing his mother had taught him to avoid throughout his life. "John, I'm going to make an unusual proposal," Michael said, taking his wallet from the inside pocket of his coat. From inside it, he pulled out a black credit card with no limit. "I want to lend you this for 24 hours. John frowned, confused. "Pardon?" "It's an experiment," Michael continued, feeling an excitement he hadn't experienced in years. "You can use this card as you wish for the next 24 hours. No restrictions, no questions. Just meet me here tomorrow at this same time to return it." The man looked at the card as if it were an alien object. "Why?" "Because I want to see what someone who seems to understand so much about true wealth would do with unlimited access to money," Michael answered honestly. John remained silent for a long moment, his blue eyes studying Michael's face as if looking for signs of a trap. Finally, with slow and deliberate movements, he extended his hand and took the card. "The PIN is 1776, Michael informed, standing up from the bench. "The year of the American Revolution," he added with a smile. As he walked away, Michael felt the weight of John's gaze on his back. For the first time in months, his heart was beating with genuine anticipation for the next day. What would that mysterious man do with unlimited power for 24 hours? Poet barked once, as if sealing that unusual agreement, and the sound echoed off the old walls of the historic town, a silent witness to another story beginning to unfold in its centuries-old streets. The light of the rising sun filtered through the curtains of Michael's bedroom, finding him already awake. He had spent the night wide awake, his mind full of thoughts about the unusual encounter the night before. Sitting on the edge of his king-size bed, he watched his cell phone, waiting for notifications of transactions from the credit card he had given to John. The first notification arrived at 7:03 a.m., a purchase at a local bakery. Michael smiled, imagining John savoring a decent breakfast for the first time in a long time, but his curiosity only grew. What else would that enigmatic man do with unlimited resources? Meanwhile, in a small boarding house room in downtown New Haven, John woke up to the smell of fresh bread and coffee. He looked at the black credit card on the bedside table, still not believing the turn his life had taken in the last few hours. After meeting Michael, John had walked the cobblestone streets, internally debating what to do. His first stop was at a modest boarding house, where he rented a room for the night, a luxury he hadn't allowed himself in months. Then he bought a hot meal for himself and for Poet. Now, with the daylight, John felt the weight of responsibility in his hands. The card wasn't just plastic and numbers, it was an opportunity and a test. He got up, put on the clean clothes he had bought the night before, and went out to the historic streets of New Haven, Poet by his side. His first stop was a clothing store, where he bought some basic but good quality pieces. Not to impress, he thought, but to give me dignity. Next, he visited a pharmacy, acquiring medications he hadn't been able to buy for a long time. As he walked through the town, John began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. The tired look of the florist who always kept a white rose, the cafe waiter who worked 2 shifts to pay for his daughter's college. Impulsively, he entered the cafe. "Good morning," he greeted the waiter. "What can I get you?" John hesitated for a moment before responding. "Actually, I came to make a proposal. I'd like to pay in advance for your daughter's next semester of college." The waiter stared at him, incredulous. How do you know about my daughter?" "Let's say I'm an observer," John smiled. "So what do you say?" After a brief explanation and many tears of gratitude from the waiter, John left the cafe feeling a euphoria he hadn't experienced in years. He continued his journey through the town, using the card for small acts of kindness. He paid for medical treatments for people in need, bought school supplies for underprivileged children, and even made a generous donation to the local animal shelter. Each action brought a smile to his face, but also a tightness in his heart. John knew that this power was temporary, and the responsibility weighed on his shoulders. At noon, he stopped in front of a bank. His heart raced as he remembered Sarah, the woman he had loved so many years ago, and the son he never knew. With trembling hands, he entered the bank and made a significant transfer to an account in the name of Luke, the name Sarah had chosen for the baby. Meanwhile, in the Thompson mansion, Michael watched the notifications arrive on his cell phone, intrigued by the nature of the purchases. Nothing extravagant, nothing luxurious. They were all modest but significant expenses. "Mr. Michael," called Anna, the housekeeper, interrupting his thoughts. "Your mother is on the line. She wishes to speak with you." Michael sighed. Barbara Thompson, the family matriarch, rarely called without an important reason, or to criticize. "Michael, darling," Barbara's voice sounded authoritative even through the phone. "I just received an alert from the bank about unusual activities on your card. Is everything okay?" "Yes, Mom," Michael replied, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Everything is under control." "Are you sure?" "Because the transactions seem peculiar." "Michael, you're not involved in anything illegal, are you?" The concern in her voice was genuine, but Michael felt a twinge of irritation. Even at 45, his mother still treated him as if he were incapable of making his own decisions. "No, Mom, it's just a social experiment. I promise I'll explain everything to you soon." After a few more attempts by Barbara to extract information, Michael managed to end the call. He looked at his cell phone again, seeing more notifications arrive. Each one of them told a story, and Michael found himself imagining the faces behind those numbers. As the day progressed, both John and Michael reflected on their lives, their choices, and the true meaning of wealth. John, with temporary power in his hands, rediscovered his ability to positively impact the world around him. Michael, observing from afar, began to question everything he had always considered important. As the sun began to set, painting the New Haven sky with shades of orange and pink, both men prepared for the reunion in the square. John, with a heart full of gratitude and a new perspective on life. Michael, eager to hear the stories behind the transactions and perhaps discover something about himself in the process. The historic town, with its colonial mansions, seemed to whisper ancient secrets as night approached. In the central square, the wooden bench awaited, a silent witness about to witness another chapter in this unexpected story. The sky over New Haven had already been tinged with the deep hues of twilight when Michael arrived at the central square. His heart was racing, a mixture of anxiety and anticipation he hadn't felt in years. As he approached the bench where he had met John the night before, he saw the familiar silhouette of the man, with Poet faithfully by his side. John stood up as he saw Michael, a warm smile on his now clean-shaven face. His clothes, though still simple, were clean and well kept. There was a new dignity in his posture, as if the last 24 hours had restored something long lost. "Good evening, Michael," John greeted him, extending his hand for a firm handshake. "I confess I spent the day wondering if our meeting yesterday had been real." Michael smiled in response, sitting on the bench and inviting John to do the same. "I also had moments when I doubted my sanity," he admitted. "But then the card notifications started coming in and I knew it wasn't a dream." John nodded, taking the credit card from his pocket and returning it to Michael. "Thank you for your trust. It was a transformative experience." "Tell me everything," Michael asked, leaning slightly forward, his curiosity evident. John took a deep breath, his blue eyes focused on the square in front of him, as if reliving every moment of the day. "At first I was paralyzed. The power to buy anything, to go anywhere. It was overwhelming. But then I remembered all the stories I observed here in this square, all the silent struggles I witnessed." He went on to narrate his actions of the day, the room at the boarding house, the new clothes, the medications. Michael listened attentively, impressed by the modesty of John's initial choices. "But then," John continued, his voice gaining a more emotional tone, "I began to see opportunities to make a difference. Remember the waiter I mentioned yesterday? I paid for the next semester of his daughter's college." Michael nodded, remembering the notification he had seen. "I saw several donations to charities as well." "Yes," John smiled. "The animal shelter, a fund for underprivileged children, a community clinic. I tried to spread a little hope where I could." There was a moment of silence between them, filled only by the soft sounds of the night in New Haven, the distant bell of a church, the murmur of conversations from the last passers-by, Poet's occasional bark. "There was a significant transfer too," Michael mentioned carefully, curious about that particular transaction. John lowered his gaze, a shadow of sadness passing over his face. That's a more complicated story," he said softly. "Many years ago, I loved a woman named Sarah. We were young, full of dreams. But I was poor, a teacher in a rural school, and she came from a traditional family that didn't approve of our relationship." Michael listened attentively, feeling that he was about to hear something crucial. "Sarah got pregnant," John continued, his voice almost a whisper. "But her family forced her to move away. I never met my son. The transfer you saw was to an account in his name, Luke. It's the least I can do after so many years." Michael felt a lump in his throat. John's story touched him deeply, making him question his own life choices. "John, I'm sorry. You never tried to find them?" John shook his head sadly. "Many times. But without resources, without connections, it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And with time I convinced myself that maybe it was better this way. What kind of father could I be living on the streets?" A heavy silence fell over them. Michael felt a mixture of emotions: compassion for John, admiration for his integrity, even in difficult circumstances, and a growing sense that his own life, despite all the wealth, had been somehow less meaningful. "John," Michael said finally, "what if I could help you find them? I have resources, connections." John's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and fear visible in them. You would do that? But why?" Michael smiled gently. "Because in 24 hours, you made more difference in people's lives than I have in years managing a hotel empire. Because your story, your integrity, make me want to be a better person. And because maybe by helping you, I can find the purpose I've been looking for." John was silent for a moment, processing the offer. Finally, with tears in his eyes, he nodded. I would like that very much." "Thank you, Michael." As night fell completely over New Haven, the two men remained on the bench discussing the next steps. The gentle breeze brought the scent of jasmine and history, and the stars began to dot the sky above the colonial buildings. For Michael, it was the beginning of a journey that promised to be more meaningful than any business deal he had ever closed. For John, it was a chance for reconciliation with a long-buried past, and for both, it was the beginning of an unlikely friendship, born from an impulsive gesture on a night that would change their lives forever. Poet, sensing the importance of the moment, rested his head on John's knee as if offering his own silent support. The colonial town, witness to so many stories over the centuries, seemed to bless this new narrative that was beginning to unfold in its ancient streets. The following days brought a new routine for Michael and John. The Thompson mansion, once a symbol of isolation, became the center of an intensive search operation. Michael had converted one of the rooms into an improvised investigation office, with maps, computers, and a team of private detectives working tirelessly. John, initially uncomfortable with the luxury of the mansion, gradually adapted to the new reality. His presence brought a different energy to the place, filling the previously silent corridors with stories and deep reflections that fascinated not only Michael, but also the house staff. On a particularly sunny morning, while having coffee on the terrace overlooking the town, Michael noticed John's thoughtful expression. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, pouring more coffee for both of them. John sighed, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "About how life takes turns, Michael. A week ago, I was sleeping on park benches. Now I'm here, drinking imported coffee and looking for a son I never knew." Michael nodded, understanding. "Do you regret accepting my offer?" "No," John replied promptly, "but I'm afraid. What if Luke doesn't want to know me? What if Sarah—" His voice faltered for a moment. "What if she's moved on and my presence only disrupts her life?" Michael put down his cup, looking directly at John. "Those are real possibilities, John. But don't you think it's worth trying? After all, you've lived with these doubts for so long." Before John could answer, they were interrupted by Anna, the housekeeper, who hurried onto the terrace. "Gentlemen, forgive my intrusion, but the investigation team has found something. They're in the study room." Michael and John exchanged expectant looks before quickly getting up, following Anna through the corridors of the mansion. In the study room, they found Charles, the chief detective, hunched over a laptop, with several papers scattered across the table. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. John," Charles greeted, his face revealing a mixture of excitement and caution. "We have a solid lead." John felt his heart race. "About Luke?" Charles nodded. "Yes, and about Sarah too. We found records of a Sarah Adams, whose age and description match the information you provided us. She's living in Millbrook, about 200 miles from here." "Millbrook?" John murmured, a wave of memories flooding him. "We used to talk about moving there, starting a new life together." Michael placed a comforting hand on John's shoulder. "And Luke?" Charles hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There are records of a Luke Adams, 17 years old, a high school student in Millbrook. Everything indicates that he is Sarah's son, and presumably John's." Silence fell over the room as everyone absorbed the information. John sat heavily in a nearby armchair, his hands trembling slightly. "They're so close," he whispered, more to himself than to the others. "All these years, and they were just a few hours away." Michael knelt beside the armchair, looking directly into John's eyes. "What do you want to do now?" John took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. "I need to see them, Michael. I need to at least try to explain, to ask for forgiveness, even if they don't want to see me after that." Michael nodded, standing up. "Then that's what we'll do. Charles, prepare everything. I want detailed information about their routines, work, school. We'll plan the best approach." As Charles and his team moved to comply with the orders, Michael turned back to John. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" John looked at his hands, noticing the marks left by years of hard work and deprivation. Then he raised his gaze, a renewed determination in his blue eyes. "No, I'm not ready, but I need to do this. For Luke, for Sarah, and for myself." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. While the investigation team refined the details about Sarah and Luke's life in Millbrook, Michael and John prepared emotionally for the encounter. John spent hours talking with a therapist hired by Michael, working through his fears and expectations. Michael, in turn, dealt with insistent phone calls from his mother, Barbara, who was beginning to suspect that something unusual was happening at the mansion. Finally, on a sunny Thursday, everything was ready. Michael and John met in the entrance hall of the mansion, both dressed casually but with care. "Remember," Michael said as they walked to the car, "no matter what happens there, you're not alone in this." John nodded, grateful for the friendship that had blossomed between them. As they got into the car, Poet, who had become a constant presence at the mansion, barked as if wishing them good luck. As the driver maneuvered to leave the property, John took one last look at the Thompson mansion. In a few days, that place had become more of a home than any other in recent years. Now, he was about to face his past and possibly redefine his future. The road to Millbrook opened up before them, winding through the hills of New England. John closed his eyes, letting memories of Sarah flood his mind. Her laugh, the sparkle in her eyes when they talked about the future, the fear in her voice the last time they saw each other. "I'm coming back, Sarah," he thought, his heart a whirlwind of emotions. "I hope it's not too late." The journey from New Haven to Millbrook was silent, punctuated only by the soft purr of Michael's luxury car engine. John spent most of the time looking out the window, watching the New England landscape unfold before his eyes. The verdant mountains, golden fields, and small historic towns seemed to tell the story of an America he knew so well, but now saw with new eyes. When they finally arrived in Millbrook, the afternoon sun bathed the tree-lined streets and colonial facades in a golden light. The town, known for its architectural beauty and historic charm, seemed to freeze time in its mansions and white-steepled churches. Michael parked the car near the town center. "According to the information we have, Sarah works at an art gallery nearby," he said, consulting his phone. "She should be leaving work soon." John nodded, feeling his heart hammer against his chest. Years of dreams, regrets, and what-ifs culminated in this moment. "Michael," he said, his voice trembling, "what if she doesn't want to see me?" Michael placed a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. "Then we'll respect her decision, but you'll never know if you don't try." They walked down the tree-lined streets, passing by enchanted tourists and locals going about their daily routines. John felt as if each step was taking him closer, not just to Sarah and Luke, but also to a version of himself he had left behind long ago. When they reached the front of the gallery, a small shop with a blue colonial facade and large windows displaying colorful paintings, John froze. Through the glass he saw her, Sarah. The years had been kind to her. Her hair, once black as night, now had streaks of gray that shimmered under the soft light of the gallery. Her features, though more mature, still carried the grace and vivacity that had captured John's heart so many years ago. "It's her," John whispered, his voice choked with emotion. At that moment, as if sensing his gaze, Sarah looked outside. Their eyes met through the glass of the storefront, and the world seemed to stop. The recognition was instantaneous. Sarah's eyes widened, a hand flying to cover her mouth in shock. For a moment that seemed like an eternity. They stood there, separated by the glass and decades of absence. Then slowly, as if moved by a force beyond her control, Sarah walked to the gallery door and stepped out onto the street. "John?" Her voice was barely a whisper, laden with disbelief and a myriad of unspoken emotions. "Sarah," John responded, taking a hesitant step towards her. I found you." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unasked questions and unexplained absences. Michael, sensing the intensity of the moment, discreetly stepped away, giving the two the space they needed. "Why now?" Sarah finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. John took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I never stopped looking for you, Sarah, for both of you. I know I have no right to show up like this after so long, but I needed to see you, needed to explain." Tears began to form in Sarah's eyes. "John, you have no idea, at all these years—" Before they could continue, they were interrupted by a young voice from down the street. "Mom?" Both turned to see a young man approaching. Tall, with the same penetrating blue eyes as John and Sarah's gentle smile, there was no doubt who he was. "Luke," Sarah said, her voice a mixture of love and apprehension. "Honey, this is John." The young man frowned, confused. "John? You mean your father?" John completed, his voice barely above a whisper. The shock on Luke's face was palpable. He looked from John to his mother, seeking confirmation, explanations, anything that would make sense in this surreal moment. "I think we need to talk," Sarah finally said, looking at John with a mixture of emotions in her eyes. All of us. Michael, who was observing the scene from afar, felt a wave of emotion hit him. He had started this journey out of curiosity, perhaps even out of boredom, but now found himself in the middle of something much bigger, much deeper than he could have imagined. As the group headed towards a nearby cafe, the sun began to set over Millbrook, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The tree-lined streets, which had witnessed centuries of stories, were now the stage for another chapter, a story of redemption, reconciliation, and perhaps a new beginning. At the cafe, seated at a corner table away from the curious ears of other patrons, John began to tell his story. He spoke about the years of searching, the hardships he faced, and how he never stopped thinking about Sarah and the son he never knew. Sarah, in turn, shared her own journey, the pressure from her family, years of guilt and regret, and how she struggled to raise Luke alone, always carrying John's memory with her. Luke, still processing the sudden appearance of a father he believed to be dead or long gone, oscillated between curiosity and contained anger. "Why now?" he asked, echoing his mother's initial question. "Why after so long?" John looked at Michael, who remained discreetly in the background before answering. "Because life sometimes gives us second chances in unexpected ways," he said softly. "And I promised myself that if I ever had that chance, I wouldn't let it pass." As the night progressed, the raw emotions began to calm, giving way to a hopeful caution. There were no quick resolutions or instant happy endings, but rather the beginning of something new, fragile, but full of potential. When they finally said goodbye late into the night, it was agreed that John would stay in town for a few days. There was much more to be said, explained, and perhaps forgiven. Back at the hotel where Michael had reserved rooms for them, John sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted, but with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you, Michael," he said simply, looking at his friend, "for everything." Michael smiled, feeling that his own journey of self-discovery was just beginning. "No, John, I'm the one who should thank you. You've shown me the true meaning of wealth and purpose." As night enveloped Millbrook in its starry mantle, two souls, once lost in their own worlds, found solace in the unlikely friendship they had formed. And on the tree-lined streets below, a long-separated family took the first hesitant steps towards reconciliation. The days that followed in Millbrook were an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved. John, Sarah, and Luke navigated unfamiliar terrain, trying to rebuild long-broken bonds, while Michael observed, offering silent support and occasional guidance. On a sunny morning, John and Luke decided to take a walk through the town. The tree-lined streets echoed under their footsteps as they walked side by side, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. "So," Luke began hesitantly, "you really lived on the streets all these years?" John nodded, his eyes scanning the colonial facades. "Yes, for a long time. It wasn't an easy choice, but at the time it seemed like the only option." Luke frowned. "But why? Why didn't you seek help? Why didn't you look for us before?" John stopped, turning to face his son. His eyes, so similar to the young man's, were full of regret. "Luke, when your mother was taken away, I was destroyed. I tried to find her, but without resources, without support. It seemed impossible. And with time, the shame of not being able to take care of you consumed me. I convinced myself that you would be better off without me." The young man absorbed the words, his expression a mixture of understanding and hurt. "You know, I grew up imagining what you would be like. Sometimes I hated you for not being there. Other times, I made up grand stories about where you might be." John felt his heart tighten. "I'm so sorry, son. I know words can't make up for the lost years, but I want you to know that there wasn't a day I didn't think about you both." They continued walking, reaching the town's central square. They sat on a bench, watching tourists and locals pass by. "Mom always talked about you," Luke said softly. "She never let me forget that I had a father who loved me even if he wasn't present." John felt tears forming in his eyes. "Your mother was always amazing. She deserved so much more than I could offer at the time." Luke was silent for a moment, absorbing everything. Then hesitantly he asked, "And now, what happens from here?" John looked at his son, a mix of hope and uncertainty on his face. "That depends on you, Luke, and your mother. I would like to be part of your lives if you'll allow me, but I understand if it's asking too much." The young man nodded slowly. "I think we can try. It won't be easy, but you're here now. That counts for something." Meanwhile, at the art gallery, Sarah and Michael were talking while she organized a new exhibition. "I still can't believe all of this is happening," Sarah said, adjusting a painting on the wall. "It's like the last 18 years have been a dream, and now I'm waking up to a completely different reality." Michael smiled gently. "Life has an interesting way of surprising us, doesn't it?" Sarah turned to him, curiosity in her eyes. "And you, Michael? How did you get involved in all of this?" "John mentioned that you helped him find us." Michael hesitated, pondering how to explain the chain of events that led him there. "Let's say I was in a moment of existential crisis when I met John. His story, his integrity, even in the face of adversity, all of it made me question my own life choices." Sarah studied him for a moment. "You know, when John appeared that day, my first instinct was to send him away. Years of hurt and resentment almost made me commit the biggest mistake of my life." "What made you change your mind?" Michael asked, genuinely curious. She smiled softly. The look in his eyes, it was the same look I saw 18 years ago, full of love and regret. And then I thought of Luke. So of all the times he asked about his father, of how he deserved the chance to know his roots. Michael nodded understandingly. "You are very brave, all of you. Rebuilding bridges after so long is not easy." "No, it's not," Sarah agreed. "But maybe it's necessary, for all of us." That night they all gathered for dinner at a local restaurant. The atmosphere was lighter than in previous days, with Luke even making some jokes about the similarities he noticed between himself and John. As they savored the typical New England fare, John looked around the table, his heart full of an emotion he could barely name. Sarah still graceful and strong as ever, Luke a perfect blend of the two, full of potential and promise. And Michael, the unlikely catalyst for all of this, observing the scene with a satisfied smile. "I'd like to propose a toast," John said, raising his glass. "To family, whatever form it takes. To second chances and new beginnings." Everyone raised their glasses, the clink of the toast echoing like a promise of better days to come. Later, back at the hotel, Michael found John on the balcony looking out at the town lights. "How are you feeling?" Michael asked, joining his friend. John smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "Complete. For the first time in decades, Michael, I feel complete." Michael nodded, feeling a wave of satisfaction. "I'm happy for you, John. Truly happy." "And you?" John asked, turning to his friend. "Has all this experience changed anything for you?" Michael was silent for a moment, contemplating the question. "Yes," he finally answered. "It made me realize that there's more to life than financial statements and corporate expansions. There are connections, stories, second chances." The two friends stood there, observing the historic town below, each reflecting on the unexpected turns that life can bring. In Millbrook, a family was being rebuilt, bonds remade with care and hope, and in the midst of it all, two souls once lost in their own worlds had found an unlikely but deeply meaningful friendship. The night advanced, bringing with it the promise of a new day, of new challenges and perhaps of more everyday miracles waiting to be discovered. The days in Millbrook turned into weeks, and the initial euphoria of the reunion began to give way to the practical realities of rebuilding long-broken relationships. John, Sarah, and Luke navigated complex emotional terrain, while Michael observed and offered support, his own journey of self-discovery unfolding in parallel. One morning, as they walked through the local farmers' market, Luke approached John with a question that had been hammering in his mind. "Dad," he began, still hesitant to use the term, "what happens when we go back to our normal lives? Are you going to disappear again?" John stopped, turning to face his son. The fear in the young man's eyes was palpable, painfully reminding him of the lost years. "Luke," John replied, his voice firm, "I promise I'm not going anywhere. I know promises might not mean much after so long, but I'm committed to being part of your life if you'll let me." Luke nodded slowly, processing the words. "It's just that all of this feels like a dream. I'm afraid of waking up and you being gone." John put a hand on his son's shoulder, feeling the weight of responsibility in his words. "I understand your fear, but I'm here now, and I intend to stay. We'll build this together day by day." Meanwhile, Sarah was facing her own challenges. On a quiet afternoon in the gallery, she opened up to Michael. "It's strange," she confessed, organizing some paintings. For so many years, I imagined what it would be like if John came back. Now that it's happened, I sometimes find myself expecting to wake up." Michael, who had become an unlikely confidant, nodded understandingly. "It's natural to feel that way, Sarah. You're redefining the entire family dynamic," Sarah sighed, putting a painting aside. "Luke is so excited to have his father around, but I don't know how I fit into this new reality. John and I aren't the same people we were 18 years ago." "Maybe you don't need to be," Michael gently suggested. "You have the chance to get to know each other again, as the adults you've become." Michael's words resonated with Sarah, offering a new perspective on the situation. As the days passed, new challenges arose. John, accustomed to a life of forced simplicity, sometimes felt out of place in the world of moderate comfort that Sarah had built for herself and Luke. Small habits, like saving food scraps or hesitating to turn on the air conditioning, revealed the deep marks that years of deprivation had left on him. Luke, in turn, oscillated between the excitement of having his father present and moments of resentment for the lost years. On a particularly tense afternoon, he exploded. "You can't just show up and pretend nothing happened," he shouted at John, tears in his eyes. "You weren't there when I needed you." The silence that followed was deafening. John, feeling the weight of each word, responded softly, "You're right, Luke, I can't change the past, but I'm here now trying to make things right. Not to pretend nothing happened, but to build something new." Sarah, witnessing the scene, felt her heart tighten. She knew that healing would take time, for all of them. Michael, observing from afar, reflected on his own life. The wealth and success he had always pursued seemed empty compared to the depth of emotions he saw before him. He began to question his own choices, the connections he had neglected over the years in pursuit of corporate success. One evening, as they all dined together, Michael surprised everyone with an announcement. "I've been thinking," he began, looking at each person at the table, "about using my resources to create a foundation. Something that can help separated families reconnect, offer support for homeless people, basically give others the chance that John had." The proposal was received with enthusiasm, especially by John, who saw in it an opportunity to give greater meaning to his own journey. "I'd like to help," John offered. "My experience." "Well, I think it could be useful." Luke, surprising everyone, also spoke up. "I want to participate too. Maybe we can help other teenagers who are going through what I went through." Sarah looked at her son with pride, seeing in him a maturity that went beyond his years. "I think it's a wonderful idea," she said, smiling at Michael. "Count me in too." As they discussed the details of the foundation, there was a palpable sense of purpose in the air. For John, it was a chance to transform years of suffering into something positive. For Luke, an opportunity to channel his conflicting emotions into something constructive. For Sarah, a new chapter that united her past with her present. And for Michael, it was the beginning of a journey to redefine the meaning of success and fulfillment. As the night progressed, the group realized they were not only rebuilding a family, but creating something bigger than themselves. The challenges were still many, the wounds were still healing, but there was a light of hope shining on the horizon. Looking out the window at the historic streets of Millbrook, John reflected on how such an old town was witnessing the birth of something new and promising. The stars shone in the night sky, like silent witnesses to a journey of redemption, reconciliation, and renewal that was just beginning. Autumn came to Millbrook, painting the streets in golden and reddish hues. With it came the need for important decisions for the newly reunited family and for Michael. On a cool morning, John, Sarah, Luke, and Michael gathered on the porch of Sarah's house. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee hung in the air as they discussed the next steps. "I can't keep living at the hotel indefinitely," John began, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup. "And Luke needs to get back to school soon." Sarah nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I've been thinking about that. John, maybe you could stay here for a while. We have the guest room and—" She left the sentence hanging, the proposal loaded with meaning. John looked at her, surprised and moved. Luke, who had been quiet, suddenly perked up. "That would be amazing. We could spend more time together, Dad." John felt a lump in his throat hearing Luke call him Dad so naturally. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose—" "It's not an imposition," Sarah gently interrupted him. "It's a new beginning, for all of us." Michael watched the scene with a smile, feeling both part of the family and an outside observer. "What about the foundation?" he asked, bringing the focus back to their plans. "I've been thinking," John said, straightening up in his chair. "What if we established the headquarters here in Millbrook? The town has a welcoming atmosphere, perfect for families in the process of reconciliation." The suggestion was met with enthusiasm. Luke, especially, seemed excited about the idea. "We could use part of the gallery as an initial office," Sarah suggested. "I have enough space there." Michael nodded, his mind already working on the logistical details. "I'll need to travel to New Haven to organize some things, but I can start the legal procedures to establish the foundation here." As they discussed the details, it became clear that this was not just a new chapter for John, Sarah, and Luke, but for Michael as well. The foundation represented a significant shift in his life, a move away from the corporate world towards something more meaningful. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's house became a center of activity. John moved into the guest room, bringing with him only a suitcase of donated clothes and some old photographs he had kept during his years on the streets. The adaptation wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, like when John, still accustomed to scarcity, stored food in his room, to Sarah's discomfort. Or when Luke, in a moment of frustration, shouted that John had no right to act like a father after so many years of absence. But there were also moments of deep connection. One night, John found Luke struggling with a math problem and spent hours helping him, reminiscing about his days as a teacher. Sarah, observing the scene from the doorway, felt her heart fill with an emotion she couldn't name, a mixture of joy, nostalgia, and hope. Michael, in turn, dove headfirst into the preparations for the foundation. He rented a small apartment in Millbrook, determined to be present during the initial phases of the project. His frequent visits to Sarah's house made him an integral part of the evolving family dynamic. One day, while working on transforming part of the gallery into an office for the foundation, Michael received a call from his mother, Barbara. "Michael, darling, what's going on?" Barbara's voice sounded concerned and a little irritated. "You've barely been showing up at the company. There are rumors that you're selling your shares. What does all this mean?" Michael took a deep breath before answering. "Mom, I'm fine. Actually, I'm better than ever. I'm starting a new project, something that really matters. More important than the empire your father built," Barbara questioned, her voice sharp. "Different, Mom. Not less important, just different." The conversation continued tense, with Barbara expressing her disapproval and concern. When Michael hung up, he felt the weight of family expectations on his shoulders, but also a renewed determination to follow this new path. That night, during dinner, Michael shared the conversation with John, Sarah, and Luke. "It's not going to be easy," he admitted. "My family, especially my mother, doesn't understand why I'm doing this." John placed a comforting hand on Michael's shoulder. "Sometimes the people we love most have the hardest time accepting our changes. Give her time." Sarah agreed. "And remember, you have a family here now too. We're all in this together." Luke, with the surprising wisdom that sometimes emerges in youth, added, "You know, Michael, you helped us find our second chance. Maybe this is yours too." The young man's words resonated deeply with everyone at the table. Michael felt a wave of gratitude and belonging that he had never experienced in his privileged but often lonely life. As the night progressed, the four remained at the table, sharing stories, laughing, and occasionally wiping away a furtive tear. Outside, the historic streets of Millbrook silently witnessed the birth not only of a reconstituted family, but of a new mission. The foundation, still unnamed, began to take shape not just in papers and plans, but in the hearts of those gathered there. It was more than a charity project. It was a testament to the human capacity to transform pain into purpose, separation into unity, and to find family in the most unexpected places. As the stars appeared in the New England sky, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. The challenges to come would be many, but for the first time in a long time, none of them felt alone in facing them. Winter arrived in Millbrook, bringing with it misty mornings and cold nights that invited long conversations around the fireplace. The foundation, now christened Bridges to Tomorrow, was beginning to take concrete shape. On one of these cold nights, the expanded family, John, Sarah, Luke, and Michael, gathered in the living room of Sarah's house. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls as they discussed the next steps. I received an interesting call today, Michael began, his face illuminated by the glow of the flames. A TV station wants to do a report on the foundation. John furrowed his brow, a shadow of concern crossing his face. I don't know if I'm ready to expose my story like that. Sarah, sitting next to him on the couch, gently placed a hand on his. I understand your hesitation, John, but think about how many people we could help by sharing our journey. Luke, who was sitting on the floor with his back against Michael's armchair, looked up from his cell phone. I think we should do it. Imagine how many other teenagers like me could benefit from seeing that reconciliation is possible. John looked at his son with a mixture of pride and admiration. Luke's maturity never ceased to surprise him. Maybe you're right, John conceded after a moment of reflection. If we can help even just one family reconnect, it will have been worth it. Michael smiled, satisfied with the decision. Great. I'll schedule the interview for next week. But remember, you only share what you feel comfortable with. In the days that followed, the house and gallery were in a flurry with preparations. Sarah reorganized the gallery space to accommodate the film crew, while John spent hours rehearsing what he would say, with Michael offering advice on how to handle the media. Luke, in turn, immersed himself in research about similar organizations, determined to contribute ideas to the foundation. His energy and enthusiasm were contagious, bringing a new dynamism to the house. On the eve of the interview, John found Sarah alone in the kitchen preparing tea. Sarah, he called softly, using the nickname from years ago. Can I ask you a question? She turned, a gentle smile on her lips. Of course, John, what is it? He hesitated for a moment before continuing. Do you think we're doing the right thing? Exposing our story like this? Sarah put the kettle aside and approached him. John, our story isn't just ours anymore. It belongs to everyone who can see themselves in it, who can find hope in it. Yes, it's scary, but it's also necessary. John nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. Thank you for everything, for giving me a second chance, for raising Luke so well. Before he could finish, Sarah enveloped him in a tight hug. For a moment, time seemed to rewind, and they were again the young lovers from years ago. The day of the interview dawned clear and cold. The TV crew arrived early, transforming the gallery into an impromptu studio. Michael, wearing an elegant but discreet suit, naturally assumed the role of spokesperson, his experience in dealing with the media evident. John, Sarah, and Luke sat together on the couch, an image of a reconstituted family that touched the heart. As the interview progressed, their stories unfolded. The painful separation, the years of searching, the unlikely encounter orchestrated by Michael, and the ongoing process of healing and reconciliation. Luke, with an eloquence that surprised everyone, spoke about the perspective of a son reuniting with his father. It's not easy, he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. There are moments of anger, of confusion, but there's also joy and the chance to build something new. It's like discovering a part of yourself that was missing. When the cameras were finally turned off, there were few dry eyes in the room. The TV crew, visibly moved, thanked the family for their honesty and courage. That night, exhausted but satisfied, they gathered again in the living room. Michael opened a bottle of wine to celebrate. To you, he said, raising his glass, for your courage, your honesty, and for showing me the true meaning of family and purpose. As they toasted, Michael's phone rang. He looked at the display, and his face paled slightly. It's my mother, he said, hesitant. Answer it, John encouraged him. Remember, we're all here with you. Michael nodded and answered the call, putting it on speakerphone. Michael, Barbara's voice sounded clear in the room. I saw the interview. There was a tense pause before she continued. Son, I didn't fully understand before, but now I see what you're doing. And I'm proud of you. Michael felt tears forming in his eyes. Thank you, Mom. That means a lot to me. The conversation continued for a few minutes, with Barbara expressing her desire to visit Millbrook and meet Michael's new family. When the call ended, Michael looked at the others, a mixture of relief and joy on his face. It seems we're building bridges everywhere, Sarah commented with a smile. John raised his glass again. To new bridges, new beginnings, and the family we choose. As the night progressed, the group remained together, sharing stories and dreams for the future. Outside, the streets of Millbrook were quiet, but inside that house, the warmth of human connection and hope burned brightly. promising better days to come. With the arrival of spring, Millbrook filled with colors and renewal. The Bridges to Tomorrow Foundation was in full operation, with John, Sarah, Luke and Michael working tirelessly to help other families reconnect. On a sunny morning, while John and Michael discussed the details of a new case in the gallery, now partially converted into an office, they were interrupted by a hesitant knock on the door. "Come in," Michael called, imagining it to be one of the volunteers. To everyone's surprise, the person who entered was an elegant, middle-aged woman, her green eyes shining with a mixture of nervousness and determination. "Barbara?" Michael exclaimed, immediately recognizing his mother. John stood up, feeling the tension in the air. "I'll leave you two alone," he said, heading for the door. "No," Barbara interrupted him softly. "Please stay. Actually, I came to meet all of you." Michael looked at his mother with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Mom, we weren't expecting you so early. I thought you were coming next week." Barbara smiled shyly. "I know, darling. But after seeing the interview, well, I couldn't wait any longer." At that moment, Sarah entered the room, followed by Luke. Seeing the scene, she stopped, immediately intuiting who the visitor was. "You must be Barbara," Sarah said, extending her hand with a warm smile. "Welcome to Millbrook." Luke, observing the scene with curiosity, approached. "Hi, I'm Luke," he introduced himself, his voice mixing respect and a touch of teenage challenge. Barbara looked at each of them, her eyes lingering on John. "You must be the man who changed my son's life," she said softly. John nodded, a bit uncomfortable. "I believe we've all been transformed on this journey, ma'am." A momentary silence fell over the room, broken by Michael suggesting that they all sit down to talk more comfortably. As Sarah prepared coffee for everyone, Barbara began to speak, her voice laden with emotion. "I came here not just to meet you, but to apologize. Michael, son, I was blind for so long. Focused only on the empire your father built, I forgot what really matters." Michael, visibly moved, took his mother's hand. "Mom, you don't have to—" Barbara gently interrupted him. "Yes, I do. I need to say this not just to you, but to all of you. Seeing the interview, hearing your stories, it made me realize how wrong I was about so many things." She turned to John and Sarah. "How you two have shown me the true meaning of forgiveness and new beginnings. And you, Luke," she smiled at the teenager, "your maturity and understanding are inspiring." Luke, usually so eloquent, just nodded, touched by the words of the Thompson matriarch. "What you're doing here," Barbara continued, looking around the room, "is extraordinary, and I'd like to help if you'll let me." Michael looked at his mother, surprised. "Help? How?" Barbara smiled, a gleam of determination in her eyes. "Well, for starters, I think the foundation could benefit from some corporate connections, and maybe I can share my own story of reconciliation." Barbara's offer took everyone by surprise. John was the first to speak up. "Mrs. Thompson, your help would be invaluable. But are you sure? This would mean exposing a lot of your personal life." Barbara nodded firmly. "I'm sure. I've spent years hiding my own struggles behind a facade of perfection. Maybe it's time to use my story to help others." The conversation continued for hours, with Barbara sharing more about her life, her regrets, and her dreams for the future. As the day progressed, the initial tension dissipated, giving way to an atmosphere of mutual understanding and hope. As night fell, while everyone prepared for an impromptu dinner at Sarah's house, Michael found a moment alone with his mother on the porch. "Mom," he began, his voice choked with emotion, "you don't know how much it means to me to have you here supporting all of this." Barbara smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "Oh, Michael, I'm the one who should thank you. You've shown me a path I didn't even know existed." Inside the house, John observed the scene through the window, a feeling of fulfillment filling him. Sarah approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. John smiled, turning to her. "About how unpredictable life is. A year ago, I was on the streets, hopeless. Now, look at us. A family, a mission." Sarah nodded, her eyes shining. "And to think it all started with an impulsive gesture from a bored magnate." They laughed together, the sound of their joy mingling with the animated voices coming from the kitchen, where Luke was teaching Barbara how to make one of Millbrook's typical dishes. As the night progressed, the house filled with laughter, stories, and plans for the future. The Bridges to Tomorrow Foundation was not only building bridges between separated families, but also between worlds that once seemed irreconcilable. Outside, the stars shone over the historic town, silent witnesses to another chapter in this story of redemption, love, and second chances. And inside that welcoming home, an unlikely family celebrated the transformative power of compassion and the courage to start anew. Summer arrived in Millbrook, bringing with it not only the heat, but a wave of changes and accomplishments for the rebuilt family and the Bridges to Tomorrow Foundation. A year had passed since the fateful encounter between Michael and John, and the transformation was palpable in every aspect of their lives. On a particularly hot morning in July, the town's central square was buzzing with activity. Colorful banners decorated the centuries-old trees, and a small stage had been set up in front of the main church. It was the day of the official inauguration of the permanent headquarters of the Bridges to Tomorrow Foundation. John, wearing a dress shirt for the first time in years, nervously adjusted his tie as he watched the crowd gather. Sarah, radiant in a floral dress, organized the final details with a team of volunteers. Luke, now 18 years old, chatted animatedly with a group of teenagers, all beneficiaries of the Foundation's programs. Michael and Barbara arrived together, both elegant but with a simplicity that contrasted with their former lifestyle. In recent months, Barbara had become an integral part of the Foundation, using her connections and experience to expand the project's reach. "Nervous?" Michael asked John, placing a hand on his shoulder. John smiled, his eyes shining with a mixture of emotion and gratitude. "A little. It's still hard to believe we've come this far." "Believe it," Michael replied with a smile. "You all made this happen." The inauguration ceremony began with Luke taking the stage to do the honors. His voice, firm and full of conviction, echoed across the square. "A year ago, I was just a teenager, full of anger and confusion. Today, I stand before you not just as John and Sarah's son, but as part of a larger family, the family we've all built here." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd before continuing. "The Bridges to Tomorrow Foundation was born from a story of loss, but it has transformed into a story of hope. We're here to show that it's never too late to rebuild, to forgive, to love." As Luke spoke, John felt Sarah's hand find his. They exchanged a look full of pride and love, not just for the son they had raised, but for the journey they had taken together. Michael, listening to Luke's words, reflected on his own transformation. The man who once measured success only in terms of profits and expansions now found fulfillment in every smile, in every family reunited, in every life touched by the Foundation's work. Barbara, standing beside her son, felt tears of joy forming in her eyes. She thought about how she had initially resisted Michael's change, and how now she couldn't imagine a life different from this. After Luke's speech, it was John's turn to take the stage. His voice, once hesitant, now carried the strength of someone who had found his true purpose. "When I was living on the streets, I dreamed of the day I would reunite with my family, but I never imagined that this reunion would lead me to a greater mission. Today, we're not just inaugurating a building. We're celebrating the human capacity to overcome adversity, to forgive, and to build bridges where there were once only chasms." Sarah, Michael, and Barbara joined John and Luke on stage for the symbolic ribbon cutting. As the crowd applauded, they embraced, no longer strangers united by unlikely circumstances, but a family forged by choice, love, and a shared purpose. The celebration continued throughout the afternoon, with music, food, and shared stories. Families who had been reunited through the Foundation's work gave their testimonials, each narrative an echo of John, Sarah, and Luke's journey. As night fell, while the square lights came on and stars began to dot the Millbrook sky, the family gathered once more on the porch of the house they now shared. "A toast," Michael proposed, raising his glass, "to love that rebuilds, to courage that transforms, and to the tomorrow we'll continue to build together." Everyone raised their glasses, eyes shining with emotion and promise. John looked at each face around him. Sarah, his rediscovered love. Luke, the son who was his greatest joy and pride. Michael, the unlikely friend who had changed the course of their lives. And Barbara, the new addition to their expanded family. He felt a wave of gratitude so intense he could barely speak. "Family," he finally managed to say, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for showing me that true home isn't a place, but the people we choose to share our journey with." As the night progressed, they remained together, sharing stories, laughing, and occasionally wiping away a furtive tear. Outside, the streets of Millbrook were quiet, but inside that house the warmth of love and hope burned intensely. The full moon rose in the sky, bathing the historic town in its silvery light. It was a silent reminder that, like the phases of the moon, life is in constant change. But for John, Sarah, Luke, Michael, and Barbara, this change had brought not only reconciliation, but a greater purpose than any of them could have imagined. And so in the small town of Millbrook, a story that began with an impulsive gesture, from a bored magnate transformed into a saga of redemption, love, and the transformative power of second chances. The Bridges to Tomorrow Foundation would remain as a living testament that with courage and compassion, it is possible not only to rebuild lives, but to create a brighter future for all.